Yesterday I posted a video about modern beachcombing, the animals that we find attached to seaweeds, for example, things like that. What I didn't say was that the day before I'd been out collecting fossils in the Silurian rocks of Shropshire, about 420 million years old, and sometimes there's surprising overlap, and you think you found the same thing. But have you? Hello again, and welcome to Life Through Time, where we look at not just the fossil record of ancient life, but also life as it is today, because it's all one thing. Paleontology is the study of the ancient history of life, but that continues with now. So in order to understand it, we have to have a good understanding of what is going on today. And that means turning over logs to see what's living underneath, looking at the slimy patches in the damp corners, wandering along beaches and picking up bits of seaweed with stuff on it. And if you've got the right mindset, then you start to see parallels very quickly. You start thinking, didn't I see something like that in a rock the other day? Seaweeds are actually a vital part of the ecosystem in many, many ways. Partly they produce oxygen, of course, but they also form a surface for other things to live on top of. And among the many things that attach to seaweeds are spirorbids. Spirorbids are tiny little coiled tubes that you find very commonly. They're often only a millimetre or two wide, but they're lovely things. Spirorbid tubes are made by a group of annelid worms. These are really familiar as earthworms, but also as ragworms and the similar polychaetes, the bristleworms that you get along modern coastlines. And they're a very diverse group. Many of them are predators with quite large jaws. Others are deposit feeders, so they just ingest sediment and digest whatever organic goodness there is in it. But then there are some groups which are really beautiful animals that have feathery tentacle arrays, and they simply sit on the surface on the seafloor, filtering water. And spirorbids are one of those. And here's a living example with its wonderful feathery tentacles from the fabulous underwater photographer Alexander Semenov. So, when exactly, you might want to know, did these little worms appear? Of course, the fossil record of worms is pretty diabolically bad because they're mostly squidgy, soft-bodied animals that just rot away and don't fossilise at all. But these things have little calcite tubes. So the tubes are perfectly well fossilisable, and in fact they do turn up fairly regularly. So the day before I collected these ones on the beach, I was at a Silurian quarry in Shropshire, out in the middle of nowhere, where you have very latest Silurian rocks. This is from a time when an ancient sea known as the Welsh Basin was closing rapidly due to a continental collision. We were bumping into Scotland. And then what you see is the last stages of this little marine basin. And all of the creatures that were living there were now in very shallow water conditions, just before the whole thing was pushed up above land, and you end up with river systems instead. These rocks are about 420 million years old, and they're full of bits of shelly fragments, brachiopods, nautiloids, the ancestors of squid and octopus, and rather like seaweeds, the nautiloid shells actually act as a host for other things to live upon them. This includes little tube worms. So on here you can just about see, I hope, little elongate, what we call cornulitids. We're not entirely sure what they were, but they're interesting little tubes which probably house some sort of worm. There's also this rather splendid specimen. It's a partial nautiloid shell. It's not complete, but this is quite a large animal. And over the surface of this there are also very small structures which you probably can't make out from there, so I'm going to have to go to the microscope. Now it's a bit weathered, but immediately you start to find some more of these little cornulitid tubes. Just the impressions of them. The shell itself has dissolved, of course, because this is very old and has been weathered. But you scan around further and there's another tube there. Then you get to this dimpled patch, which is actually the remains of a bryozoan fossil. Look at the beachcombing video if you want to see more of that. Little cracks and things all over the surface, something's going on there as well. And oh, hello, hello, what's that there? This, of course, is a little coiled spiral tube, which looks basically identical to what we are seeing on the seaweeds. Okay, so these specimens are dissolved. All we have is the impression of the little tube, but we also know from other material that it is also preserved as calcite. So these are little calcite tubes and they look the same. So the problem is we don't have the soft tissue. We have no idea whether it had little feathery tentacles. We don't even know for certain whether it was a worm. How do you find out? Well, the best way is to look at the detail, the microstructure of the tubes. See if they are secreted in the same way. See if they look like the same animal made them. This is something we can't do with our little weathered out bits of shape. But other people have spent a great deal of time and effort trying to work out the detailed microstructure of these tubes. One of the first things they noticed is that the fossils start off at the very earliest stage of the growth with a little bulb-like chamber at the end. And this is not what you find in modern Spirorbids. It gets worse though because the microstructure of these things is very much lamellar and then is pierced by puncti, little pores running through the shell, and sometimes by pseudopuncti, which are disturbances that look a bit like pores but they're not really holes. And all of these details suggest that these are actually unrelated to Spirorbids. They are not the same thing at all, despite having superficially an extremely similar shell. As a result, these ancient fossils are now known as Microconchids, an entirely separate group. What were they? That's a big question. There is no definite answer yet, but the similarity in the shell structure to what we see in brachiopods, lamp shells, is interesting. And there are little worm-like relatives of brachiopods called pheronids that today do not secrete a shell. It's just possible that you've got something in this group which are generally called lophophorids because they have a lophophore, sort of filter feeding array. Until quite recently, this arrangement of these groups of animals has been slightly problematic because it wasn't clear that they were even closely related to each other. There may be other phyla, other major groups separating them. But a lot of work on the molecular studies on recent years seems to be arriving at the conclusion that brachiopods and pheronids and also bryozoans are one very compact group which all are very closely related to each other. So in that case it becomes plausible that you can have characters like the worm-like shape from one phylum and the secretion of the shell of another phylum. Because they're all so closely related, it does make sense. Probably. So although we don't have 100% definite certainty on these things being related to pheronids, probably they were very close to this group at least. Putting that aside though, we can ask how long the history of these microconchids was. How long did they survive for? When did they go extinct? And also look backwards from the modern. So we have Spirorbids today. They clearly evolved at some point. So where do they overlap? And it gets quite interesting because they don't quite overlap, but they almost meet. The youngest known microconchids appear to be Jurassic. The oldest known Spirorbids appear to be Cretaceous. Sometimes, if you don't have very well preserved material, it can be very hard to tell which you've got. But that is, as far as I'm aware, the current state of knowledge, that you have the microconchids originating somewhere around the Ordovician, late Ordovician, about a mile that way apparently, and then they carried on for, about 250 million years, until they go extinct shortly before we have the first Spirorbids appearing to take their place. Obviously, that was an ecological niche that just needed to be filled by whatever was handy to evolve into it. But it's interesting, that. I think that'll do it for now, though. We've got lots of other problematic tubes and other weird fossils that I'm sure we'll get onto at some point, some of them much more controversial than the Microconchids are, believe it or not. But I hope you enjoyed that, and you are quite likely, whatever geological period you're looking at, to stumble across some of these things at some point. And hopefully now when you see them, you won't just think, tiny fossil. And you'll actually stop and try to make sense of it, because that, after all, is why we do all this. So, thank you once again for dropping in, and I will see you next time. Don't forget to subscribe.